Hello, and welcome to Encounters with Polish Literature, brought to you by the Polish Cultural Institute, New York. I'm David Goldfarb, and I'll be your host. It is fairly uncommon to find opportunities to talk about Hawaii and Poland in the same context, but today's clip at the top of the program from Ala Moana Beach Park with Magic Island and Diamond Head Volcano visible in the background is not irrelevant to our discussion for today about Jarosław Iwaszkiewicz, as you will see. I'm on the road right now, recording this introduction from somewhat foggy Los Angeles. We have two fantastic guests on our program today and some great texts to talk about, so we'll save Iwaszkiewicz's biography and background for our discussion. Antonia Lloyd-Jones has translated works by many of Poland's leading contemporary novelists and authors of reportage, as well as classics, biographies, essays, crime fiction, poetry, and children's books. She is best known for her translations of novels by Nobel laureate Olga Tokarczuk. One of her earliest translation projects was of works by Jarosław Iwaszkiewicz called The Birch Grove and Other Stories from CEU Press. Her most recent publication is the Penguin Book of Polish Short Stories, for which she selected and co-translated 39 stories dating from 1925 to the present. Benjamin Paloff chairs the Department of Slavic Languages and Literatures at the University of Michigan, where he is also professor of comparative literature and a faculty affiliate of the Frankel Center for Judaic Studies and the Copernicus Center for Polish Studies. His most recent books are Worlds Apart, Genre and the Ethics of Representing Camps, Ghettos, and Besieged Cities from Columbia University Press in 2025, and Bakhtin's Adventure, an essay on life without meaning from Northwestern University Press, also in 2025. Versus Computer, his third collection of poems, is forthcoming in 2026. He has translated about a dozen books and many shorter literary and theoretical texts from Polish, Czech, Russian, and Yiddish, notably works by Dorota Masłowska, Marek Bieńczyk, Ryszard Weiner, and Yuri Lotman. And he has received grants and fellowships from the Michigan Society of Fellows, the Stanford Humanities Center, and the National Endowment for the Arts, among others. Let's go to the discussion that we recorded a few weeks ago while we were in London, Ann Arbor, and Honolulu, respectively. Antonia and Benjamin, it's fantastic to have you both on the program again.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you for inviting us.
Okay, so why don't you, let's start out by talking a little about, who was Jarosław Iwaszkiewicz, and, tell us a little about his background.
Jarosław Iwaszkiewicz was born in 1894 in a Ukrainian village called Kalnik, and he lived a long life, and he died in 1980 in Warsaw. He studied music, which is very significant, and law in Kiev, and then he moved to Warsaw permanently in 1918, so just after the First World War. And he worked on various literary periodicals and was famously a member of the Scamander group of poets, who included notable poets like Julian Tuwim, Antoni Słonimski, Jan Lechon, and Maria Jasnoszewska-Pawlikowska. So there were lots of very strong poets in the interwar period. And mostly he used, and more all of them really used, traditional forms in their poetry rather than abstract forms. And they all were people who rejoiced at the regained independence that Poland finally got after the First World War, but they didn't like nationalism or militarism. And each of these poets developed their own individual style. But only Iwaszkiewicz in this group of poets was also a very prominent prose writer. And he had some interesting career points. He worked for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. In 1932 to 36, he was a diplomat in Copenhagen, and Denmark quite often features in his work. And he also worked in Brussels. He really was prolific as an author. He wrote novels, including the 3-volume saga called Fame and Glory, which is really a kind of portrait of his generation. He wrote lots of short stories, and many of them are novella length. He wrote plays. He translated from French authors including Rambo and Gide, and from Danish, so Hans Christian Andersen and Soren Kierkegaard, Russian, Chekhov and Tolstoy. He wrote the libretti for operas, often the ones composed by his very close friend Karol Szymanowski. He wrote literary criticism, essays, and memoirs.
He and Szymanowski were traveling in Africa, right? I mean, if I'm not mistaken. And where else did they went to Sicily as well?
I think he was greatly fond of Italy and went there quite a lot. And there are some wonderful, wonderful stories set in Italy and based on his travels there. And then he was the editor of a literary journal called Twórczość from 1955. And he was an extremely erudite person who knew world literature, music. He was incredibly musical. He knew history and religion and languages. And there was some criticism of poor old Iwaszkiewicz because some of the other writers criticized him for loyalty, or you could call it compliance with the authorities in the communist era. And he was chairman of the Polish Writers' Union. But actually, I think it was part of his whole kind of philosophy that comes through in his stories of an acceptance of the situation as it is. And he never mistreated anyone in the context of the Writers' Union or as editor of Twórczość, but he actually helped a lot of people who suffered at the hands of the regime and of censorship. And he very often published authors in Twórczość who were opponents of the regime. So he managed to sort of walk a middle path. And although he was criticized for this loyalty, I would say it was rather unfair.
It was kind of a paradox. I mean, that on the one hand, I mean, the conflict was, between those who stayed and those who left, I thought. And, Miłosz wrote an essay after Iwaszkiewicz's death, addressing this question of like his criticism, Iwaszkiewicz's criticism of the emigres. But, what could one do? I mean, either you were an emigre and you were, not sticking it out and not being, loyal to Poland in some way, or you stayed and you had to be complicit with the system, it seems.
Or find a compromise. And it was very hard to satisfy everybody, I think.
I think so.
If I can just add a footnote to this, I would say that it's from my own reading is of this very long biography is that it's a bit more, in fact, than the conflict between those who stay and those who go, which is, maybe emblematized by someone like Czesław Miłosz as an emigre versus Herbert. They had a major falling out around this very question. Iwaszkiewicz was not simply someone who stayed. Yeah. He was a major wheeler dealer in the very center of power in culture, and was well aware of what was happening to some writers versus others. I totally agree with Antonia that his attitude was very much one of consistently through his life of like, no, you just deal with the situation you get. There's almost a reluctance in his stories to engage in deep philosophical speculation or soul searching. You just kind of take the situation as it comes. And in his case, he really did seem to, throughout his life, really, really enjoy being in power in literary circles, being at the head of editorial groups, being at the head of organizations. He was the chair of the Writers' Union for decades. So it's, I wouldn't simply say that he was, writing comfortably in his apartment, hoping that the authorities don't look at him.
Mm-hmm. That's fair.
He's a complicated figure in that way, but also there's a nice thing that Leszek Kołakowski wrote a very nice introduction to this collection of Iwaszkiewicz's stories that I translated rather a long time ago.
I don't know which book cover is the more recent one.
Old edition. This is the first one.
Yes,
recent. What you guys have but it's exactly the same book. So Kołakowski's introduction, he talks about this whole issue, and he defends Iwaszkiewicz and comes down on the side of him being being on the side of the angels, not the devils, really.
I think that's right.
But he says an interesting thing. He says that the central message of Iwaszkiewicz's work is a melancholy affirmation of the world as it is. And I think that's a nice way of putting it. So he says it's never directly expressed, but coming to terms with reality in Iwaszkiewicz's writing is a sign of spiritual maturity. However, that doesn't mean we have to passively put up with everything that happens. And so, for instance, Iwaszkiewicz and his wife, Anna, during the war, it wasn't that they just sat there doing nothing. They did what decent people did, and they took part in the resistance, and they hid Jews and people who were conspiring in the underground at great personal risk, as many Polish people did, of course, motivated by that sense of this is what you do. So it wasn't that he just accepted a bad situation and did nothing.
No.
So, I think he's a good man.
I think so too. So let's look at some of the work. Would you like to start by looking at one of your translations? Do you want to look at the Birch Grove, which is a wonderful story?
I think the Birch Grove is one of the best written pieces of Polish literature that I've ever read. I think it's just the most exquisite and beautiful story. And his stories are very dense. They take a bit of an effort to read properly and a bit of time. Nowadays, people just want the facts of a story and everything to brush along. But he writes about, not a whole lot happens in his stories, but they're about everyday human concerns, about love affairs and family relations. But they are exquisitely written. Brzezina, the Birch Grove, was written in 1932. So it was written before the Second World War, and Iwaszkiewicz was 38 at the time when he wrote it. And just to summarize the plot briefly, it's about two brothers who meet after many years apart, and they've grown apart and they don't really understand each other at all. Stanisław, the younger brother, is an elegant man of the world, and he's come back from Europe, as Western Europe is referred to, but he's come back with a terminal illness. And Bolesław, the elder brother, is a forester who's recently been widowed, and he's completely consumed by his job. And each of them in the course of the story becomes aware, in a different way, but just as forcefully, of the bitter emptiness of life. And there's a gradual turnaround in the story, because the brother who's full of life, Stanisław, who loves life, and has been, even though he's been cut off from the fancy world where he had all sorts of fun, he still finds beauty and vitality in nature here out in the woods where he's come to die. And in the course of the story, he dies physically. Meanwhile, his brother Bolesław, who's depressed at the beginning of the story, and since his wife's death has given up on life and hides away from people, he can't even relate to his own child. He gradually comes back to life spiritually. So there's this contrast going on. And the story starts with Stanisław arriving at this remote forester's lodge in the woods. And he's been sent there from the sanatorium in Davos because he's doomed. He's going to die soon. And his tuberculosis is incurable. And he's got nowhere to go but back to his estranged brother's remote home in the woods. And next to the house, Bolesław's wife is buried in a very beautiful birch grove that Bolesław regularly visits and goes and mourns miserably. And Stanisław instantly annoys Bolesław by having garish, brightly coloured socks, and by being different, by being alive and chatty. And he disturbs Bolesław's self-imposed isolation. He immediately befriends Bolesław's little daughter, a very neglected child called Ola,
Hola.
He also has a piano imported from the local town, and he plays it, which also irritates Bolesław in the extreme, and he chews his moustache in rage every few pages. And although Stanisław is full of grief for the life he's left behind and knows he can never recover, he finds life in this remote place as well. And he gets every last drop of it out of his remaining days on earth, making friends with the workers who live in the next door cottage and having a final fling with a very coarse but attractive peasant girl called Malina, who is not very choosy. She's a sort of thirsty character, a nature figure.
That's a very British way of putting it.
Not choosy.
Not very choosy.
She's in fact described in the story repeatedly as a compulsive liar. And that she just says that she's with whoever happens to be with her, which is great.
She's in love with every man who she happens to be snogging with in the bushes. Yes. So anyway, she's an interesting character because she's indifferent to life and death. There's this life and death struggle going on in this story, and she's indifferent to both. She loves all of it and sleeps with anyone. And meanwhile, Bolesław sulks because he's unable to share Stanisław's very unlikely joie de vivre. And occasionally they clash. And Bolesław is actually very cruel to his dying brother. But he simply can't communicate with him. But gradually, Bolesław comes out of his shell. And Stanisław's vivacity, as well as his decline towards death, force Bolesław to confront his own depression. And by the end of it, when Stanisław has died, Bolesław is back among the living, having a fling of his own with Malina, and planning to leave for a new district where he and the little Ola can start life again, away from the Birch Grove, where by the end of the story, there are two graves, his wife's and his brother's, but he can now move away from death. So in the course of the story, the tables have turned, and it's incredibly beautiful. To me, this story is like music. It's like a concerto. Each short chapter is like a movement. And there are themes and echoes and crescendos and diminuendos. And the story is absolutely full of music. It's full of oral sensations. So there's bird song. There's the sound of the rain drumming on the roof. There's the piano that Stanisław keeps playing. There's the accordion that Michał, the workman who lives next door, keeps playing. There's the singing. Malina sings a beautiful song while Stanisław is dying. And so it's very much a feature of Iwaszkiewicz that his writing is often very sensual. He plays on the senses. And I think there are contemporary Polish writers who've picked up a great deal from his style, Paweł Hula notably. And in fact, Olga Tokarczuk also uses the senses in this same way. And sometimes his work is more about the visual, but in this story, it's about what you're hearing.
Yeah, it's not the only one. There's another story called The Fourth Symphony. I heard an excellent paper by Jan Czerniecki at University of Köln it was at SCEs a couple of years ago. But he often uses that kind of musical structure. And one thing that I thought was really interesting was the contrast between the music that, which of course I'm interested in because of where I am, the music that Stanisław is playing on the piano, which is, sort of music of the Hawaiian craze of the 1920s and 30s, which made its way to Poland. I mean, there was a film called Czarna Perla, the Black Pearl, set in Tahiti with a popular song called Hawaiisko Noc, in the Hawaiian Night, performed by Eugeniusz Bodo and Henryk Wars Orchestra. And why are people in Poland so writing music with slide guitars and so forth? It's because it was just popular worldwide, and this is urban music. And Stanisław hates Michał's music. He's playing like folk music music on the accordion, which is he kind of comes to terms with eventually in the end. But it's as if these are like the two kind of competing leitmotifs in the musical structure, I think.
At one point, he actually notices a popular tune in the folk tune that is being played, and
Yes.
thinks of, and suddenly becomes aware of how time allows information to penetrate even to this like remote forest cabin, right? Because he says like, oh, that it must have been like, oh, the 15 years that it took for it to sort of wend its way from Western Europe to popular, say, radio or urban performances in Poland. And then eventually, it's going to filter down like any popular music, right? Eventually it becomes folk music.
I find this very emotionally affecting, this story, and very haunting. It's completely unforgettable. I think it's one of the most brilliant pieces of Polish writing I've ever read. And he's particularly good at nature descriptions. He has very powerful images. So I'll read you can I read you two bits?
Sure.
This first bit kind of gives you an idea of the relationship between the brothers, but also the psychological effect of Iwaszkiewicz's writing. So at this point in the story, Stanisław has had a piano brought in, and it's very difficult to cart this thing through the woods and unload it. And he has some help from the workers in the next cottage and so on. Throughout the unloading of the piano, Bolesław had not once showed his face. Evidently, he had shut himself in his room and wouldn't even come and look at the offensive instrument. The night was very warm, and Stash was no longer thinking about his brother. As he was playing the banal tunes, he could sense the pain of this black night and its terror. For the time being, he wanted to remain in ignorance of Bolesław's state of mind. After a while, Bolesław came in with great commotion and stormed up and down the room. Finally, he sat down on the bed, tugging at his beard. Only after a time did he say, "You know, I find that piano of yours and all your playing very hurtful. You just don't seem to appreciate that you're in a house of mourning." "A whole year has gone by," said Stash, without interrupting his playing. His words sounded florid and theatrical, like the opening of a ballad. Bolesław shuddered. "I find that music intensely irritating," he said. "So do I," said Stash, and stopped playing. "It conjures up a world I'll never go back to, and which I never really got to know. I used to gaze at it all from my window. I saw some things through the window pane that would have been beautiful if only I could have touched them. But I never did, and I never will. It's like glass, like something made of thin ice. Listen, Bolek," he said in a serious tone. "I can tell there's something you haven't realized. You don't know why I've come here." "What do you mean?" "I know my cheerfulness and my music annoy you, but please let me go on just a little longer. You see, I won't be here for very long. In my illness, before the final stage, there's usually an improvement. It lasts for a few weeks. The doctors take advantage of it to send the patient off anywhere at all, back home or to the country, somewhere private, so that he doesn't die at the sanatorium. My remission is already coming to an end. I'm very sorry, my dear fellow, but I really can't help it. I wish I could." At this point, he smiled, "But I can't. So please don't give me too much of a fight. I came here to die." Bolesław stood still in the darkness, but Stash wasn't looking at him. He was still captivated by the dark night beyond the open window and was thinking of Miss Simons, regretting that he hadn't fallen in love with her, and humming the Hawaiian tune. "Why don't you have any nightingales?" he asked after a while. "There were some, but they seem to have stopped singing now." Bolesław stood up and paced about the room, but his step was calmer and quieter now, as if he were trying to tread carefully. A couple of times he came towards Stash and stared into his face, pallid in the darkness, his expression fixed as if on another planet. But Stash took no notice of him. An inner lament was reverberating in his sickly lungs. Only later did he say, "You see, that's what happens when it passes from the lungs into the intestine." Bolesław left the room without a word and vanished onto the veranda.
One thing I like about that passage is the way it starts out, like with many of the conflicts between the two brothers, is with something that's, seems kind of trivial. I mean, like, for instance, they have another conflict later about, that Stanisław doesn't like the butter. And that's the kind of thing that Iwaszkiewicz is always like kind of tuning into, like really the monotony of everyday life. The conflicts are not even, in, stories that seem to have much more dramatic material. He'll like leave out the most dramatic material and, focus on these little irritations and conflicts among family members, things that you wouldn't think would make good, material for literature, but they reveal always something deeper, something bigger going on.
Yes, absolutely. That's very true. He's very good at these details, and they're all familiar to people. It speaks to anybody.
His stories are actually, I think, are quite accessible. They are about real life interactions, real life problems. They're very Chekhovian. If you've read Chekhov's short stories, these will seem familiar in the way he constructs social dramas. But then there are elements in this that in modern fiction you almost can't do. He frequently, and it's not just him, this was true of his whole coterie of writers, but especially Iwaszkiewicz, he frequently indulges in what we refer to sometimes as a pathetic fallacy. When your problems are solved, you go outside and the storm clouds part. And the sun shines down, or to mention just the nightingale at the end of that passage, which is at the beginning of the story, and this is a long story. It's a novella, really. At the end, of course, when things sort of settle out, what shows up? Oh, there's the nightingale, right? And in fact, there's in the same collection that Antonia translated so fantastically. And the thing is, I would also recommend, I know that this program is in part for readers who might be interested in engaging this material they might not know before. This translation really is a masterpiece. But the piece that opens the collection called A New Love is actually based entirely on pathetic fallacy. A guy is sort of hearing the door, someone's at the door, and it's this woman he's sort of started seeing, and he plays out the entire expanse of their imagined relationship, from exhilaration and infatuation to kind of relaxation of one's passions to disappointment, all these things. And as it happens, as he's playing this out in his head, as someone's at the door, there's a rose on the table that like is Beauty and the Beast disintegrates as the love is disintegrating in his head. All of this happening, of course, over the course of like 90 seconds of real time. This is not how flowers behave in real life, but it is totally how they behave in an Iwaszkiewicz story. And so he's often doing these things that will seem, in fact, quite familiar. His prose is quite accessible. He's very different from some of the more avant-garde writers we've talked about in the interwar period, Gombrowicz, Schulz. This is not difficult reading, but he peppers the prose with some insanely brilliant social observations about the way people behave. And the other thing that I would also mention as being really important is that he does this very often in regard to sex and sexuality and eroticism in a way that's quite open. For the time, Iwaszkiewicz was himself married to a woman. I've seen all kinds of ways of trying to explain his sexuality, but I think that just circumstantially is maybe best. He was married to a woman. They had a very a kind of storied relationship that is played out in a long correspondence. But his sexual preference seems to have been largely for men, or almost entirely for men, and he was open about this in Poland as early as the interwar period, and so he writes about sexuality and sexual desire very frankly, in a way that will be surprising to some readers.
It's one recurring theme on that we'll see, which I think becomes bigger in Mother Joanna of the Angels, is the idea that of a character who hasn't been able to really realize true love and doesn't quite know why. I mean, and that's true of Stanisław, certainly. He says he was reminded again of all the lost opportunities for love in Warsaw and before his illness, and then in Davos, and then it made him feel sorry that he'd never been able to fall in love with anyone. And it's if certainly in the Wilco Girls, as Antonia lovely way that Antonia translates it, rather than the Maids of Wilco, which is how it's usually translated in reference to Vida's film, which sounds like, I don't know, a crew of cleaning ladies or something like that. But in the Wilco Girls, also, you have this situation where the main character Victor is he's physically attracted to women but can't fall in love with anyone, and his descriptions of men are as vivid as the descriptions of women in that story. So it's left there for anyone to see. It's not like he's hiding anything.
The Wilco Girls, which I'm not happy with the title because the word Wilko has a lot of significance too, which is lost.
Sure.
And Panne, again, it's not exactly girls, but it's unmarried women, so it's referring to them in the past.
Yeah.
But I always feel that it starts with this Victor, this narrator, going back into his past and going and visiting this family where there are 5 sisters, and he hasn't seen them since before the First World War. And but he goes because he's depressed because of the death of a male friend who he works with. And I've always felt that it's actually saying that was the person he was in love with. Mm-hmm. Who's died. And then it was based on Iwaszkiewicz's relationships with a family of boys.
So in the interest of time, would you like to move on to Mother Joanna, which has only been partially translated in the Daedalus book of Polish fantasy, which is a very difficult book to get. I ordered it as we were just when you mentioned that it was available, and I got it from London in like 2 weeks, which was remarkable. But the whole story is worth reading, and not just the passages there. In fact, that selection starts like kind of right after like the climactic scene, certainly the climactic scene in Kavalerovich's film, which is the scene of 4 priests, doing an exorcism. And that's, we don't get that in this version. So we need a new translation, which I hope you might be working on.
I'm very much hoping to translate the whole book because it's essentially a novella, and it is absolutely superb. It's really a Gothic horror. Mm-hmm. Mother Joanna or Mother Joanna or Mother Joan of the Angels is the name of the Mother Superior at the center of the story. And again, Iwaszkiewicz's sad affirmation of life is often said to conceal a metaphysical or a religious outlook. And this is the novella that illustrates that feature of his work the most plainly. It's also terrifying. It has the most fantastic tension and sense of threat from the very start. It's full of grotesque, creepy characters. And the Kawalerowicz film is actually very good. He compresses it slightly. But what's important in this story, I talked about sensuality in Iwaszkiewicz's writing, and how he's manipulating you by using your hearing or your sight or whatever. Here it's about dark and light. There's a great contrast going on the whole time between what's happening in darkness and what's happening in light. This story is based on the famous 17th century incident of the nuns who were possessed by devils in the French city of Iyudin. And Iwaszkiewicz transposes the whole story to the east, to the Smolensk area, to a town that he calls Iyudin. And there are a lot of retellings of this in literature. There's Aldous Huxley wrote The Devils of Iyudin, which is the same thing. He wrote it later than Iwaszkiewicz. And then there's a Ken Russell film, and Penderecki wrote an opera based on this story, but not based on Iwaszkiewicz's version. So it's a long, complicated plot, and I'll try and summarize it. Father Surin, who's a Jesuit priest, travels from Paloff to perform the exorcism of Mother Joanna of the Angels, who's the Mother Superior at an Ursuline convent in a remote place called Iyudin. And it's a kind of ongoing problem because a priest named Garnietz, who has apparently corrupted the nuns and bedeviled them, has since been tried by a sort of inquisition and burned at the stake before the story starts. But the nuns are still possessed by devils, and previous attempts to exorcise them have failed. So Surin has been called in as a very saintly man with the power to rid the place of its devils. And on his journey to the convent, we get wind of the fact that despite being extremely devout, he has suspicions of a latent demon in himself, which he calls his black spider. And he stops at an inn where a gypsy predicts woe for him. And a down-at-heel landowner latches onto him. So there are all these strange, creepy characters. And there's another inn close to the convent where all the locals are gossiping about the nuns and their behavior, and their comments and wild ideas are threaded through the story. And the local parish priest suggests to Surin that far from being possessed by devils, maybe these nuns are just sinful women, as bad as Eve and every woman since. And when Surin first meets Mother Joanna, she gives a very mixed impression, but she seems to want him to save her. And their encounter ends with a sudden display of the power of the 9 devils inside her, who through her lips scream defiance and obscenities and kick the priest. So only one of the 19 nuns at this convent is not possessed, and she's called Sister Małgorzata. And she drops in at the inn now and then for gossip with the locals. And so, first of all, Surin witnesses the exorcism that you talked about, David, where the 4 other priests attempt to exorcise the nuns. And it's a kind of show. The local prince comes to watch, and his noblemen. One of the noblemen later seduces Sister Małgorzata, the nun who's not bedeviled, and then dumps her, so that she's got a whole subplot. So during this exorcism, the nuns dance around and behave strangely and obscenely, and they react violently to being sprinkled with holy water. And at first there seems to be some success, and one of the devils seems to be responding to the priest's orders to leave Mother Joanna's body. But the other devils are much too strong to obey, and there's a whole shocking scene of lewd behavior and cursing God. And eventually Mother Joanna collapses, exhausted by this ordeal. So the next day, it's going to be Surin's turn to try to exorcise these devils. And he tries a rather calmer approach, but he seems to have achieved some success. And by the end of it, Mother Joanna is calm. But within days, she and all the nuns are possessed again. So he does a lot of praying for the devils to leave Mother Joanna, and is prepared to take them on himself. And then he tries a different tactic of talking to her on her own at great length and praying with her and getting him to tell her all about herself. And he becomes increasingly obsessed with her. And this rids her of 4 devils, but not all of them. And he gets more and more desperate. And eventually he's tempted to consult the local tzaddik, a Hasidic rabbi who's noted for his holiness. And this is a desperate move. The tzaddik gives him short shrift, suggesting that Surin may be bedeviled himself, which stirs up the priest's growing fears about his own purity. And he's, after this encounter with the tzaddik, he's desperate to succeed, and he goes off to talk to Mother Joanna again. This time, she tells him that she doesn't actually want the devils to leave her because they make her special. And if they leave her, she'll just be condemned to a boring convent life. Mm-hmm. However, if he could make her into a saint, she'd be satisfied. So by now he's in love with her, perhaps. And he seizes her hands in his eagerness to help her. And he tells her that he can't make her a saint, which causes her to despair. And then she sticks her hands through the bars of a kind of makeshift barrier between them and grabs his head. He's kneeling down to talk to her. And the devils leave her and enter him. And he screams and rushes off, and he's seen by everyone in the convent raving.
It's the moment of countertransference. Yeah. Like after all of this conversation, all of this talk therapy, and then the devils fly out of her and into him.
Yes. So then he's aware of the devils that are inside him, and they've awoken his dormant devil. And so he's shut up at the house of the parish priest, and a decision is made to send him back home to Paloff. But on the way, at an overnight stop at the Gypsies Inn, the devils torment him, saying that they will go back to Mother Joanna if he doesn't do as they tell him. And they force him to commit a dreadful crime. And he axes to death the 2 young men, the serving men, who are sleeping in the stable. And so this dreadful thing happens. And as a sort of epilogue, we learn that Mother Joanna wasn't immediately free of her devils, but only a few years later stopped being possessed and continued to run the convent, and was eventually succeeded after her death by Sister Małgorzata, who, as we know, had run off with one of these noblemen and then been dumped by him. So it's a strange story.
A couple of interesting things going on there are that, on the one hand, we think of, well, this is really Gothic, right? And so, there's a lot of over the top stuff, but he leaves out probably what would be the most over the top thing, which is the burning of what's the name of the priest who corrupted them? Garnietz, right? Who was modeled after Grandier, who in France, who supposedly corrupted the nuns of an Ursuline monastery there, and it may have been kind of a political plot orchestrated by Cardinal Richelieu. But the burning of the stake would have been this totally overshadowed the rest of what happened, if he'd included it. So it was a way to it seems to me, to kind of bring it back to this story of everyday life, of even if it's like dramatic things like demonic possession. But the other thing is that this is his wartime story. I mean, this is in the way that Zbigniew Herbert in a report from the besieged city, writes about the 80 Years' War as a way of dealing with contemporary politics. Maybe this is also some kind of sublimation of what's happening in the war with a certain amount of plausible deniability because it's about something that happened in the 17th century.
Stories are never, in fact, or movies, or they're never made about the place or time where they're set. They're always made about the place or time where they're made. Yeah. I think that makes total sense. In fact, I do think that that's quite intuitive. What strikes me as consistently remarkable in that and in all of his fiction is the almost complete absence of taboo. And we already talked about that a little bit with regard to sex and sexuality, but this, in this particular text, Iwaszkiewicz is playing with all kinds of religious fire, quite literally. But it's not just one does not get a sense from reading this or really anything else I've read of Iwaszkiewicz, and I can't pretend to have read all of it because Iwaszkiewicz, it was incredibly prolific,
and he lived a long time.
He wrote for a long time, but he also wrote a lot over that time, and consistently. But he does not he does not write as a provocateur. So one of his contemporaries, in fact, someone he knew well, Stanisław Ignacy, whom we've talked about before, you and I, David, on this program, was a provocateur. He would write representations of sex, religion, etc., and he does have a very famous play in which the nun does have a rather cartoonish sexual erotic life. And he would do this to offend the mores of Polish society. Iwaszkiewicz did not do that. He was not looking to offend anybody. It's just that in the story, if the nun is sleeping with a nobleman, she's sleeping with a nobleman. It's just laying it out, and generally without judgment, without moralizing. But simply saying things as they are. So I think that while you can totally read Mother Joan as having this kind of war, this resonance with the war situation, I think just as much here he sees, here's an interesting moment where we can talk about politics, erotic life, and religious identity in a story that will that in fact demonstrates this as a general human story, not simply as something that's historically rooted in this one incident in France.
Antonia, would you like to look at that passage of where he has the meeting with the rabbi? Because I mean, to give a rabbi such a prominent role, in the middle of the Holocaust is a little provocative.
And in fact, I should also add, Iwaszkiewicz and his wife were designated as righteous among nations. After the war, they protected many Jews during the roundup of Jews in Nazi-occupied Poland. And again, though, I would say that it wasn't like they were out looking to protect Jews. They protected their friends. So if you were an intellectual who was Jewish, fine. And you could even look at the editorial group of Scamander, which was so influential in the 20s and 30s. This was almost a 21st century editorial collective. You have Iwaszkiewicz with his somewhat patrician Polish identity, but then you have Słonimski, who was a Jew who lived as a Christian. He was religiously Catholic, but he was ethnically Jewish. Tuvim, who was an assimilated Jew. Lechon, who was, if I'm not mistaken, I think he was actually Tatar of Tatar extraction. This was an ethnically and religiously mixed group of people, and that was just normal. And you can see that all over. I don't think that I think one of the special things about the arrival of the Tzaddik in this story is how unspecial it is.
He wrote this in 1943, and when in the middle of the war. And I think it's his general thoughts about evil in this historical guise. And there are lots of complicated theological questions built into this story. And everyone keeps talking about devils and wondering where evil comes from. Not just Surin, but the parish priest and the boys he eventually murders, Surin murders. They keep talking about devils and what they are. And the main discussion is this one between Surin, the Jesuit priest, and the tzaddik, Reb Isha. So I've got a bit of this here. So at this point, Surin has gone to see Reb Isha because he's desperate to find some way to get rid of these devils. And he realizes at the start of this section that the rabbi knows about the nuns. You know? He asked. I do, said the rabbi calmly. What is it? Asked the priest. I don't know. I'd have to see. Oh, sighed the priest. If they're real demons. That's right, Surin took him up eagerly. Are they real demons? And what in fact are demons? Reb Isha suddenly lost his indifference. A strange expression ran across his face and his eyes sparkled. He laughed ironically. And the Reverend Father comes to the poor Rebbe to ask what demons are. Don't you know, Father? Weren't you taught sacred theology? You don't know. Are you in doubt? Maybe it's not demons, just a lack of angels. He laughed again. The angel has flown from Mother Joanna, and now she's left alone with herself. Maybe it's just human nature. Father Surin lost patience. Swiftly, he stepped up to the table and stood facing the rabbi, stretching out a hand to him. The young man by the door moved, shifting from foot to foot. Reb Isha drew his head back so that his eyes were in shadow, while the candles lit up his black satin kaftan and the thin arabesques of his skimpy beard. Don't judge, Jew, don't sneer, cried the priest abruptly. I know you have more knowledge than I do, but here you sit in your windowless room, over your books, over your candles, and you don't care in the least that people are suffering, that women... Father Surin fell silent. Hidden in the shadows, the tzaddik's eyes glittered with such contempt and derision that indignation robbed the priest of speech. Seeing that sharp arguments wouldn't do him any good here, he let his hands drop. Women are suffering, repeated Reb Isha. Let them suffer. Such is the fate of women, and no one can escape their fate. Here he cast another meaningful glance at Father Surin. For a while they said nothing. Tell me, Father Surin suddenly whispered in a beseeching tone, what do you know about demons? The Jew laughed. Sit down, priest, he said, and sat down himself. His eyes returned to the orbit of light from the candelabra. Father Surin sat on a stool. Now they were separated by the narrow oak table and an open book. Father Surin was surprised to see that the book contained Latin text. The priest leaned across the table towards the tzaddik and stared at his narrow lips, closed shut between the sparse strands of his moustache and beard, as if sensing the taste of bitterness. We have our learning for ourselves, said Reb Isha after a while in a low tone. And you refuse to fight against the evil spirit? Asked the priest. In the first place, Father, give it a name. What is an evil spirit? Said Reb Isha with an ironical smile. And where does it live? And what is it like? And where does it come from? Who created it? He suddenly shouted louder. Did the Lord create it? Adonai? Father Surin drew back. God, he cried. Who else could have created it? And who created the world? Asked the rabbi enticingly. Stop it, whispered Father Surin again. And what if Satan created the world? Are you a Manichaean? And if the Lord created the world, then why is there so much evil in it, and death, and diseases, and wars? Why does he persecute us, the Jews? He suddenly cried plaintively, like at the synagogue. Why do they kill our sons and rape our daughters? Why must we send to the Pope? The Jews are sending an envoy to the Pope to repudiate all the dreadful things they say about them. Where does it all come from, Reverend Father? Father Surin did not feel well in this chamber. Heat and stuffiness prevailed in here. Beads of sweat were trickling down his forehead. The small silver vessels that stood between the candles were giving off a rather heavy odor of scent that Father Surin found unpleasant. The ideas voiced by the tzaddik were not new. Not once, and not 100 times those questions had occurred to him, but expressed as clearly and forcibly as this, they drove him to despair. He didn't know how to answer them, either to himself or to the Jew. So that leads into the absolute collapse of Father Surin, and the rabbi says to him these terrible words that Surin later repeats, I am you and you are I. And he brings out the devil in Surin. He points out his own potential evil to himself, to him. And so this is the beginning of the end for Surin.
I think it's also like, it comes back to that theme that starts out, with characters unable to find love, right? But here it's about just the radical, incommensurability of individuals, being able to understand the experience of the other, right? I mean, it's like he has to say, I am you and you are me. And this is the thing that he's trying to overcome with Mother Joan, too. I mean, can he really, know what her experience is like? Can he really understand the demonic possession or whatever is underlying it? I think that, and that's in part a theme that comes from the war, is this this question of hatred.
This strikes me every single time I'm reading his fiction, is how the world is in Iwaszkiewicz's idea of the world is a world of available knowledge. So some characters are described in terms of their blindness, and some are described in terms of their sight, and sometimes that shifts. And in the Birch Grove, for example, we during his most bitter, resentful phase, Bolesław is described as being blinded by work, blinded by cares, etc. And then he kind of wakes up to nature and sexuality and desire as he's looking at Melina, etc. But this is never presented as some kind of deep mystery that he had to delve into. He's either blind to the information, the knowledge that is available to him, or he sees it. And that happens repeatedly in Iwaszkiewicz's stories, this idea that the world is simply available. The world is at hand. And it is up to us to tune ourselves to what's there. But once we do, it's actually there. So this is not like what all of these suggestions of religion, spirituality, metaphysics, politics to some degree that we're bringing up. These things are not matters of long philosophical exploration or rumination in anything that Iwaszkiewicz writes. There's nothing that you could extract from this that could actually be presented as a, say, philosophy or even as an aesthetics the way you can with a writer like Witkowski or Schulz. With Iwaszkiewicz, it's simply open your eyes. And characters are repeatedly telling each other to do that in one way or the other. Just open your eyes. It's right there.
So other than, trying to find somebody to publish a new translation of Mother Joan of the Angels, what are you up to? You've got like a million things. You've got the Hey on Why festival right now, and
yes.
What else?
Małgorzata Lebda is here in London, and we have an event this evening to promote her novel Voracious, which I translated. And then what's going on very soon, next week, the Penguin Book of Polish Short Stories is coming out, which is an anthology I compiled with work from various translators, and it covers 100 years. Actually, the oldest story in it is Iwaszkiewicz's New Love, which Benjamin spoke about, A New Love, written in 1925. So that's 100 years ago.
That's great.
And it's as fresh as a daisy with its petals falling. And so then later this year, there's my translation of Mikołaj Łaziński's book, which we're calling My Name is Stramer. It's coming out with Pushkin Press in August. Okay. And that's a story based on the author's family, of a Jewish family where there were 6 siblings, and it's really their lives before the Second World War. It runs into the Second World War, and there's a sequel about how they all survived it. And it's a fantastic book. It's a really good read. In August, the reissue of House of Day, House of Night by Olga Tokarczuk will be out. This time, there are no cuts in the book, and everything that was in the original Polish has been reinstated. So and meanwhile, I'm working on a novel about a Hasidic shtetl, which is called Golem by Maciej Płaza.
Oh, wonderful.
I'm steeped in the world of Reb Ishay at the moment. And then I'm going to be translating, I've just translated Not There by Mario Szczygiel, which is a book of, I suppose you could call them essays, but they're about all sorts of aspects of absence in life or loss. But it's a quite interesting collection of eclectic collection of articles. And
you've got more. Wait, there's more.
There is more. So I will be translating Zita Rudzka's novel Only Those with Teeth Can Smile.
Okay, we got to mention that one. All right.
I will be co-translating with Jess Jensen-Mitchell Jerzy Pilch's book, which our title so far is The Register of Adulteresses. Okay. And then I'll be doing Anna in the Catacombs by Olga Tokarczuk.
All right. And let's let Benjamin get in a few words about his new book, which is just out.
2 books came out in the last month. One is called Worlds Apart, Genre and the Ethics of Representing Concentration Camps, Ghettos and Besieged Cities. That's with Columbia University Press and is on, as the title suggests, mostly concentration camp literature by people who survived those experiences but chose to fictionalize the representation instead of writing testimonials. And then I have a book that came out last week called Bakhtin's Adventure, an essay on life without meaning. That's from Northwestern University Press, and it is a reinterpretation of Bakhtin's philosophy, the Russian philosopher Mikhail Bakhtin, and his ideas about narrative, but instead of asking the question, which is often plaguing people like me, why does Bakhtin talk about literary characters like they're real people? The interpretation of this book assumes that Bakhtin and all of us think about real people as we think about literary characters. and that is, in fact, an essential feature to how we compose our world picture. So those two books just recently came out. Otherwise, I'm not quite as valuable, I would say, as Antonia, but I'm working on this summer. I will be finishing translations of Marek Bieńczyk's book on melancholy. And also a very large book and an important one by Adam Leszczyński called A People's History of Poland.
That's fabulous that you're translating that. I didn't know who was translating it. I'm very, very pleased to hear that you're doing that.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
All right. Well, thanks so much for joining me on the program again, and I hope we have another opportunity in the very near future.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks. Great seeing both of you.
Thank you very much, David. It's lovely to see both of you, and I hope we'll meet up again soon.
Wait up. Please subscribe and click the bell to stay on top of the program. Watch the credits for some recommendations about how you can support aid for Ukraine and for Ukrainians fleeing the war in their country. I'd like to thank all the people who helped make this series possible. The Polish Cultural Institute New York sponsors our program. Bartek Remisko, head of humanities and literature at the Polish Cultural Institute New York, is our executive producer. Natalia Iyudin is my fellow producer and editor. Our opening and closing music is by Radek Przedpelski. Thank you all for listening and reading along with us. Let's meet again in a month for another encounter with Polish literature. See you then.
Jest to szary dzień, jak zawsze w tej okolicy. Cała sceneria dodaje się chwilami fotografiom z ilustrowanej gazety. Tak szare, tak płaskie są domy, ludzie i pojazdy.